The sun was setting behind the jagged mountains as Jamie and her friends piled into their old, beat-up van, ready to tackle a weekend road trip that promised freedom, adventure, and a break from the monotony of college life. They had mapped out a route along the winding country roads of upstate New York, a place famous for its scenic views and eerie, abandoned towns. Jamie had always been drawn to the thrill of the unknown, the adrenaline rush of getting lost somewhere unfamiliar. But nothing could have prepared her for what awaited them that night. It started as any typical road trip story would: laughter, loud music, and the casual argument over whose turn it was to choose the next playlist. But by the time they reached the narrow, twisting roads near an old ghost town called Havenbrook, the atmosphere shifted. The sun had disappeared entirely, leaving only the dim glow of the van's headlights to illuminate the cracked pavement ahead. The air felt heavier, almost charged, and Jamie noticed that the usual comforting sounds of crickets and distant owls were absent. There was only silence, an oppressive, unnatural quiet that seemed to swallow even the hum of the engine. They were joking around, making light of the emptiness, when the first sign that something was off appeared. A figure emerged from the side of the road, dressed entirely in black, standing perfectly still as if waiting for them. They slammed on the brakes, hearts racing, but the figure didn't move as they passed. Jamie swore she saw it raise a hand in a slow, deliberate wave, though none of her friends admitted seeing it. Shaken, they pressed on, telling themselves it had been a trick of the shadows, a stranger walking late at night. But the feeling that they were being watched clung to them like a second skin. They reached an old rest stop, one of those decrepit roadside stations that hadn't seen regular use in decades. The gas pumps were rusted shut and the windows were smeared with grime. Jamie needed a bathroom break, so she stepped out into the cold night air. The moment her feet hit the gravel, a strange smell hit her. A mix of wet earth and something far more metallic, almost like blood. Her flashlight flickered as she moved toward the small building, and that's when she noticed it. Faint scratch marks along the side of the structure, too tall and uneven to be caused by any normal animal. Goosebumps prickled her arms as she hesitated, listening to the wind, expecting some creature to leap out at her, but there was only silence, or so it seemed. Inside the restroom, everything looked abandoned yet strangely recent. The toilet paper roll was half full. The sink still had water droplets in it, as though someone had been there just moments before. Jamie shook off the unease and returned to the van, trying to laugh, trying to tell herself she was being paranoid. But the feeling didn't leave. She climbed in, noticed that her friends were unusually quiet, staring out the windows at the empty road behind them. The air inside the van was thick, suffocating, like the night itself had a weight. They resumed driving, the headlights carving tunnels through the pitch dark countryside, and that's when they heard it, tapping. A rhythmic, deliberate tapping on the roof of the van. At first, they laughed it off, thinking it was branches brushing the vehicle. But the sound didn't stop, it followed them, perfectly timed with the van's movement. The tapping moved from front to back, as if someone, or something, was pacing above them, keeping in step with their speed. Jamie's friend Mark, trying to be brave, pulled over to check. They all piled out, hearts hammering in unison, scanning the darkness around them. Nothing. No trees, no animals, no sign of any person. Just the road stretching endlessly into the black void. They returned to the van, convinced they were letting their imaginations get the best of them. And yet, as soon as Jamie started the engine, a shadowy figure appeared in the road ahead. Not crossing it, not walking along it, just standing there, motionless, perfectly still. The van screeched to a halt, and the figure didn't flinch. A cold wind whipped through the air, though there was no storm, and Jamie swore she could hear whispering, just beyond the limits of her hearing. A single word repeated. Leave. Panic set in. They decided to take the next turn to get off the road entirely. But no matter how many turns they took, no matter how many side roads they tried, they kept ending up on the same stretch. The same desolate road, the same shadow in the distance. And then the tapping returned, louder now, accompanied by something else. Faint, dragging footsteps behind the van, moving in perfect sync with their terrified speed. Jamie's hands were slick on the steering wheel, knuckles white, heart hammering like a drum. Her friends were whispering prayers, none of them admitting they felt the same dread that rooted her to the seat, eyes darting to every shadow, every flicker of movement in the dark. Hours seemed to pass in minutes. The darkness twisted around them, making the road ahead look unfamiliar, even though they were sure they hadn't taken a wrong turn. And then they saw it. A rundown bridge over a narrow river, illuminated only by the van's headlights. As they drove onto it, Jamie noticed the figure again closer now, standing in the middle of the bridge, motionless. She screamed, swerving violently to avoid it, tires screeching on the metal grates. But when they looked back, the figure was gone, just gone. No footprints, no sound, nothing. Only the wind rushing past, and the oppressive silence of the night returning. Relief was short-lived. The van's engine sputtered, coughed, and died. Dead in the middle of the bridge, the friends froze, realizing the full extent of their vulnerability. No cell signal, no other cars for miles, and the only light came from their dying headlights. Then came the whispering again, closer now, echoing off the steel structure. Leave, or stay forever. Jamie wanted to run, to scream, to do anything, but they were trapped. Panic spiraled as the temperature dropped inexplicably, their breath visible in the air, though it had been a warm night. The bridge seemed endless, stretching into a darkness that had no end, and then, without warning, the van started again. No explanation, no coaxing. Just started. Jamie floored it, careening off the bridge, desperate to put distance between them and whatever had been stalking them. The road twisted and turned, finally opening into a small highway. They didn't stop until dawn, exhausted, shaken, and silent. When they finally looked back at the bridge from a safe distance, it was gone. Not collapsed, not hidden by fog, completely vanished, replaced by nothing but empty road and river. None of them ever spoke of it again, but the terror lingered. Years later, Jamie still refuses to drive near abandoned roads after dark, and she swears that if you listen closely, you can hear the tapping waiting for the next traveler foolish enough to pass by. It was a brisk autumn evening when Ryan decided to take his girlfriend, Claire, on a spontaneous road trip along the back roads of Pennsylvania. They had been dating for barely 6 months, but the excitement of escaping the city for the open road had them both buzzing with anticipation. The plan was simple: leave after work, drive until they found a quaint inn or campsite, and let the road dictate their journey. What started as a romantic adventure soon turned into a nightmare neither of them could have imagined. The first few hours were uneventful. The countryside stretched endlessly, dotted with fields and small towns that seemed to have frozen in time. Ryan loved the way the trees swayed in the wind, their leaves painting streaks of gold and crimson across the fading daylight. Claire, content in the passenger seat, flipped through a travel guide, marking potential stops and places to explore. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, shadows began to stretch unnaturally across the road, clinging to the edges like dark, living fingers. Ryan noticed the change immediately. The air grew still, heavy with an almost tangible weight, and even the usual sounds of nocturnal wildlife were strangely absent. They turned onto a narrow, barely paved road that Ryan remembered seeing on a map as a shortcut to a nearby small town. The road was lined with dense forest on either side, trees forming a dark tunnel overhead. At first, it was thrilling, like a scene straight out of a horror movie, but soon, unease began to settle over them. The headlights barely penetrated the gloom, and every bend seemed to reveal the same shadowy stretch of road, as if they were driving in circles. Claire tried to laugh it off, insisting they were just tired and imagining things, but Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching them. The first sign that they weren't alone appeared when Ryan saw a car parked on the shoulder, engine off, windows dark. A figure stood nearby, half hidden by the trees. It didn't move as they passed, didn't even seem to breathe, just waited. Ryan instinctively slowed the car, eyes darting to the rear-view mirror. Nothing followed, but the hair on his neck stood on end. He sped up, trying to leave the unease behind, but the feeling only intensified. The road ahead seemed to narrow, the darkness pressing in from all sides, suffocating and thick. Then, without warning, the sound of footsteps echoed behind them. Soft at first, almost imperceptible, then growing louder, in perfect rhythm with their speed. Ryan's grip tightened on the wheel, and Claire's hand found his, squeezing tightly as if to anchor herself to reality. They spotted a small, abandoned farmhouse at the side of the road. Its windows were broken, the paint peeling in long strips, and a rusted swing creaked in the cold wind. Desperate for a break, Ryan pulled in, hoping to calm their nerves and maybe figure out why the road felt so wrong. As they stepped out, the smell hit them, a mixture of damp earth and something fouler like decay. Claire froze, staring at the door. "Do you smell that?" she whispered. Ryan nodded but said nothing, his eyes scanning the perimeter for movement. That's when they saw it, a figure, barely visible in the shadows of the porch, watching them. Tall, thin, and impossibly still, its face obscured. When Ryan called out, there was no response, only a low, almost imperceptible whisper carried on the wind, "Go." Panic rose quickly. Ryan grabbed Claire's hand, and they ran back to the car, fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, and they sped off, desperate to leave the farmhouse, and whatever lurked there behind. But as they turned back onto the road, they realized with growing horror that the road no longer seemed familiar. Every turn, every curve led them back to the same stretch, the same dark forest looming on either side. The trees seemed to bend closer, their branches clawing at the edges of the headlights. The sense of being hunted was undeniable now, and neither of them spoke, each too afraid to break the fragile silence. Hours passed, or at least it felt like hours. The moon had risen, casting pale light over the twisted landscape, and with it came a new terror. Ryan noticed shadows moving just beyond the tree line, slinking between the trees in impossible silence. He swerved, trying to avoid them, but the shadows mirrored their movements, keeping pace, always just beyond the reach of the headlights. Claire whimpered softly, curling into the seat, praying for the road to open into a familiar town. But the road refused to give them mercy. It was endless, a looping corridor of darkness and dread. Then came the sound, a low, guttural growl echoing from behind them, followed by a soft scratching against the roof of the car. Ryan slammed the brakes, heart hammering, and both of them jumped at the sudden stop. They waited, breathless, listening as the sound circled the vehicle, teasing them, mocking them. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of heavy breathing, uneven and ragged. Ryan grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and shone it out the window, but the beam revealed nothing. The shadows had disappeared, leaving only the whispering wind and the eerie stillness that followed. With no other choice, Ryan decided to keep driving. They stayed on high alert, eyes darting to every shadow, every flicker of movement. The feeling of being followed never left, a constant pressure at the edge of their senses. And then they saw it, a single figure standing in the middle of the road ahead, illuminated briefly by the headlights, motionless, silent, impossible. Ryan swerved violently, nearly losing control, and when they looked again, the figure was gone. No footprints, no sign of where it had gone, nothing, just the dark road stretching endlessly before them. By the time they reached the first town signs, dawn was breaking. The shadows of the forest receded in the morning light, but the terror lingered, etched into their memories. The townspeople were polite but seemed wary, glancing nervously toward the forest. When Ryan asked about the roads they had traveled, the locals' faces went pale. "Haven't you heard?" One man muttered. "That road, it's cursed. People disappear out there, the forest. It doesn't let them leave." Ryan and Claire exchanged a glance, shivering despite the rising sun. They had seen things that defied logic, felt a presence that could not be explained, and survived something most would never believe. Years later, Ryan drives cautiously, avoiding winding back roads and deserted stretches of highway. Claire refuses to step near a forest after dark, and though they rarely speak of that night, the memories linger in every rustle of trees, every shadow on the road, every tapping noise that seems to follow them from the corners of their past. They survived, but they carry the fear with them, a silent reminder of the road trip that should have been an adventure, but instead became a haunting encounter with the unknown. A group of college friends begins with a cheap thrill during spring break. There were 4 of them: Mike, Jenna, Lewis, and Sarah, who had decided to drive across the Midwest, hopping from one small town to another, living off cheap motels and gas station snacks. Their plan was spontaneous, fueled by a sense of invincibility and youthful bravado. They laughed off warnings about the long stretches of desolate roads and the occasional news reports of disappearances. After all, nothing bad could happen to them, or so they thought. Their trouble began on the second night. They were driving through a stretch of highway that seemed endless, flanked by flat farmland and the occasional abandoned silo. The car's headlights barely cut through the darkness, and the radio had been playing static for hours, with only the occasional faint, distorted music breaking the monotony. It was in that eerie silence that they saw something unusual: a lone hitchhiker standing by the roadside, thumb raised, face obscured by a hood. The group exchanged uneasy glances, but Mike insisted. "Come on, it's just someone needing a ride. We're good people," he said. Reluctantly, Jenna rolled down the window, and the figure climbed in without a word. At first, it seemed harmless. The hitchhiker didn't speak, simply staring straight ahead, his hands resting calmly on his knees. Lewis joked nervously, asking if they should have offered him a snack, and Sarah laughed, though her eyes kept flicking to the rear view mirror. There was something unsettling about him, something that made their stomachs twist. He didn't acknowledge their questions, didn't react to their jokes. He simply sat there, a quiet presence that made the car feel smaller, more oppressive. It wasn't long before the tension escalated. As they drove further, the highway began to feel unfamiliar. The landscape no longer resembled the maps they had studied. The towns they passed seemed abandoned, and the occasional streetlights flickered as though struggling against the darkness. That's when they noticed the hitchhiker's behavior. He turned slowly, just enough for them to catch glimpses of a pale, almost sickly face. His eyes, black and unblinking, seemed to pierce into each of them, scanning their thoughts, their fears. The car fell silent, the only sound the occasional hum of the tires against the asphalt. Suddenly, the radio crackled. At first, they thought it was static, but then came a faint, distorted whisper. "Turn around." The voice was low, almost gurgling, yet unmistakably directed at them. Lewis laughed nervously. "Yeah, right. Very funny," he said, glancing at Mike. But the hitchhiker's expression didn't change. He just stared, unmoving. Then the voice came again, louder this time, almost as if it were coming from inside the car. "Turn around, or you'll never leave." Jenna's hand flew to her mouth, and Sarah's grip tightened on the seatbelt. Mike frowned, unsure whether to laugh it off or admit the creeping terror rising in his chest. That was when the car's GPS stopped working. The map blinked and froze, showing only one point, the stretch of road they were on, extending endlessly in both directions. Panic set in. They tried to turn back, but every turn seemed to lead them deeper into the same desolate landscape. The hitchhiker didn't react to their attempts at conversation, but his stare intensified as though feeding off their fear. The air inside the car grew colder, a chill that seeped into their bones. Shadows flickered along the dashboard, shapes twisting and writhing, impossible to identify. The friends were trapped in their own vehicle, a cage with no escape. Hours seemed to pass in a blur. The silence was broken only by whispers, low and urgent, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. The friends began to argue, pointing fingers, trying to make sense of the nightmare they were trapped in. Mike insisted they keep driving forward, convinced that eventually they would reach a town. Jenna wanted to pull over, desperate to escape the invisible presence that seemed to haunt them. Lewis tried to reason, but his voice faltered as the shadows outside the windows grew darker, stretching impossibly toward the car. Sarah, paralyzed by fear, whispered prayers under her breath, hoping anyone would hear them. Then it happened. The hitchhiker leaned forward, his face now fully visible in the dim light of the dashboard. His eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark, and his mouth opened in a silent scream that seemed to resonate in their minds. The air became heavy, thick with the scent of decay and something metallic. The friends screamed as the car lurched violently, almost as if the road itself had risen up to attack them. For a terrifying moment, they lost control, the tires spinning helplessly on the asphalt. When the car finally came to a stop, the hitchhiker was gone, just gone. No door opened, no footprints, nothing. Only the chilling emptiness of the road and the echo of that silent scream lingered. They didn't speak for miles. Every shadow, every rustle of the trees outside seemed to hint at his presence, stalking them just beyond sight. Eventually, they reached a small, brightly lit town, a place that seemed almost too ordinary after the surreal horror of the road. The local diner was bustling, a stark contrast to the dark emptiness they had left behind. But even in the safety of light and other people, the unease remained. They tried to explain, but the locals only shook their heads. There's been reports. Strange things on that stretch. People disappear, cars turn up empty, or the drivers come back. Changed? One waitress said quietly, avoiding their eyes. Years later, the friends rarely spoke about that night, but each had their own lingering memories. Mike couldn't drive after dark without glancing in the back seat, expecting to see a shadowy figure there. Jenna avoided roads with little traffic, the fear of being trapped never leaving her. Lewis had recurring nightmares, waking in a cold sweat at the sound of tires on asphalt. And Sarah, she never traveled far from her hometown, convinced that the hitchhiker could return at any moment, waiting for the next car, the next victims to ensnare. That night on the endless highway had changed them all, and the memory of the hitchhiker, the silent, unblinking eyes, would haunt them forever. David, a man who decided to take a solo road trip across the Appalachian Mountains during the fall, never expected his journey to twist into something terrifying. David loved hiking and old roads, and he was chasing the vibrant colors of autumn leaves. He had mapped out quiet backroads, thinking the solitude would be peaceful, almost meditative. But what he didn't expect was how quickly the quiet could turn into something sinister. On the second day of his trip, David was driving along a narrow, winding road that snaked through dense forests. The road was barely more than a single lane, flanked by tall, imposing trees whose branches reached over the asphalt like skeletal fingers. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows that flickered across the hood of his car as he navigated the curves. He felt a thrill of excitement mixed with unease, the kind of feeling you get when you know you're completely alone, but can't quite explain why your stomach twists. It started subtly, with the sound of another car behind him. At first, he assumed it was a normal vehicle, a late traveler like himself. But as the minutes passed, the car stayed close, tailgating in a way that seemed deliberate. David accelerated slightly, hoping to lose the tail, but the car matched his every move. Curiosity gave way to unease when he noticed something strange about the headlights. They were too dim, too yellow, like candlelight trapped in glass, and they flickered intermittently. David's instincts screamed at him to stop, but the road offered few safe places. Finally, he spotted a small clearing just off the asphalt, enough for him to pull over. He slowed, and the other car also stopped a short distance behind him. Heart pounding, David decided to get out, just to confront whoever was behind him. As he stepped out of the car, the chill of the evening hit him, sharper than the temperature warranted. Leaves rustled underfoot, but there was no wind. The figure from the other car didn't approach. Instead, he remained in the driver's seat, silhouetted by the dim glow of the fading sun. The man's face was partially obscured by a hood, but David could make out a cold, emotionless expression. There was something wrong with him, something that made the hair on David's arms stand up. When David returned to his car, ready to drive off, he noticed something even more unsettling. The tail lights of his own car flickered, and when he looked up, the hooded man's car was gone, completely vanished as if it had never been there. Shaking off the fear, David convinced himself it had been a trick of the light, a trick of the shadows on the road. He continued driving, though he now kept a constant eye on the rear view mirror. That's when he noticed the fog. It rolled in suddenly, thick and unnatural, enveloping the road in a ghostly gray that distorted the edges of the trees and made the familiar curves of the road seem alien. Within the fog, shapes seemed to move just out of the corner of his eye. Twisting shadows, elongated and almost human, darted between the trunks, disappearing when he tried to focus on them. The road narrowed further, and David had to slow to a crawl. Then he saw the signs, hand-painted, nailed crookedly to trees along the roadside. They were simple, black letters on splintered wood, warning turn back and leave now. He laughed nervously, rationalizing it as a prank by some local teenagers. But the signs became more frequent, more urgent. The messages changed tone. You should not be here. Alone is dangerous. And finally, they are watching. David's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He considered turning around, but the curves of the road made it impossible to see more than 50 feet ahead. As he drove, the temperature dropped rapidly, frosting the inside of the windshield. He could see his own breath now, visible in the dim, unnatural light of the fog. Then he heard it, the sound of footsteps on the roof of his car. At first, he thought it was branches scraping against the top, but the rhythm was deliberate, heavy, and moving in a way no tree could mimic. Panicking, David accelerated, trying to shake whatever was on top of his car. The footsteps stopped instantly. He glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. The hooded man was there, standing on the road behind him, impossibly still. But it wasn't just him. Shadows seemed to rise from the fog around him, writhing and twisting in shapes that were almost human, almost animal, and yet neither. David slammed on the brakes, his tires skidding across the slick asphalt, but the figure didn't move. Then, without warning, the man vanished. The shadows dispersed like smoke, leaving the road empty, silent, and eerily calm. David didn't stop again until he reached the next town, where the neon lights of a gas station were a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness he had just escaped. He parked, shaking uncontrollably, and ran inside. The attendant looked at him curiously as he recounted the events, dismissing it as exhaustion. But David knew what he had seen. He left immediately, avoiding the winding roads, sticking only to highways and populated areas. Months later, he learned that the road he had been on was infamous locally for disappearances and unexplained phenomena. Hikers and travelers had reported seeing hooded figures, shadows that moved independently of natural light, and roads that seemed to shift, stretching and twisting, as though the forest itself were alive. Some who ventured too far into the fog were never seen again. David never returned to the Appalachian backroads, but even in the safety of his home, he would occasionally hear footsteps on the roof at night, accompanied by the faint sound of whispering from the foggy distance, reminding him that what he had encountered on that road had never truly let him go. A couple, Jenna and Mark, decided to take a road trip along the Pacific Coast Highway in California. They had planned a romantic getaway, imagining long drives with the ocean on one side and cliffs on the other, stopping at small towns and enjoying the sunsets. But what they experienced on the second night of their trip would haunt them forever. They had checked into a small, rustic inn in a town that seemed almost deserted. The innkeeper was unusually quiet, with a pale, almost waxy complexion and a fixed, blank stare. Jenna and Mark chalked it up to shyness or fatigue and went to their room, which had a large window overlooking the cliffs. The room was cozy, with a fireplace and antique furniture, though there was a faint smell of mildew. As night fell, the wind picked up along the coast, rattling the windows. Jenna was reading while Mark unpacked their things when suddenly the room went cold. Not just a little chilly, the air felt sharp, biting, like walking into a freezer. The fire in the fireplace dimmed unnaturally, flickering as if struggling to stay lit. Mark joked about it, saying the old wiring must be the problem, but Jenna couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Around midnight, they were awakened by a faint scratching sound coming from the window. Jenna, curious and a little frightened, pulled back the curtain. There was no one outside, only the cliffs and the crashing waves far below. But the scratching continued, louder now, moving across the glass as if something or someone were circling the room. Mark went to investigate, opening the window, but there was nothing there. No footprints, no signs of an intruder, nothing. The next morning they decided to leave early, uneasy but trying to brush it off. As they packed their car, the innkeeper appeared in the doorway, silent and watching. Jenna felt a shiver run down her spine. He didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there, his expression frozen and unreadable. They waved awkwardly and drove off, hoping to forget the incident, but the unease followed them. Driving along the coast, they noticed a car behind them, tailing them for miles. It wasn't aggressive, just always there, appearing in their mirrors at every turn. Jenna tried to rationalize it, thinking it was coincidence, but Mark felt it too, a persistent sense of being watched, of being pursued. They took a detour through a small, winding road along the cliffs, hoping to lose the car. Instead, it followed, its presence unnervingly patient, almost sentient. By the time they reached a viewpoint overlooking the ocean, the car was gone, vanished without a trace, leaving Jenna and Mark alone in the fading light. Relief was short-lived. As they admired the sunset, they noticed shadows moving across the cliffside. At first, they thought it was wildlife, deer or other animals darting through the brush. But then the shadows grew larger, moving in unnatural, jerky motions, as if whatever it was didn't belong to the natural world. Mark suggested they return to the highway, but Jenna hesitated. There was a path leading down the cliffs to a secluded beach, almost hidden from view. She felt drawn to it, inexplicably compelled. Against Mark's protests, she insisted on walking down, feeling a strange mix of fear and fascination. They made their way carefully, the narrow trail winding through rocks and shrubbery. The shadows on the cliffs above seemed to follow them, elongating and twisting as the sun dipped below the horizon. On the beach, the wind howled, carrying with it strange sounds, low murmurs, whispers almost beneath human hearing. The waves crashed violently, yet the beach remained unnaturally calm in some spots, as if the sand itself resisted the water. Jenna and Mark felt an oppressive weight, a sensation of being trapped in a space that shouldn't exist. That's when they noticed the markings in the sand, footprints, but not human. Large, clawed, unevenly spaced, leading toward the water and back, disappearing into the surf. Suddenly they heard a scream echoing across the cliffs, high, pitched and piercing. They ran back up the trail, hearts pounding, only to find their car had been moved from the parking area to the edge of the cliff, teetering dangerously close to falling. Mark grabbed the wheel and pulled it back onto solid ground, both of them shaking uncontrollably. The innkeeper appeared again, this time at the top of the trail, watching silently as the couple scrambled to safety. They left the town immediately, driving through the night without stopping, but the feeling of being watched never left. On the highway, headlights appeared behind them again, though no car could ever be seen in the rearview mirror. They took every exit, every detour, but the lights persisted, maintaining a distance that was close enough to intimidate but never enough to confront. When they finally returned home, safe in their own city, they noticed marks on their arms and leg, scratches, small cuts that neither of them could explain. Months later, they researched the town. There were stories of travelers disappearing, of strange lights along the cliffs, of whispers carried by the wind that drove people insane. Locals refused to speak of it openly, offering only cryptic warnings about wandering near the cliffs at night. Jenna and Mark never returned to California for another road trip. The memories lingered, though, especially at night, when the wind howled outside their windows, carrying with it faint whispers, the sound of claws scraping stone, and the feeling that something was waiting for them, patient and unyielding. The next story comes from a solo traveler named Alex, a thrill seeker who loved road trips along the backroads of the Midwest. One fall, he decided to take a trip through the rural parts of Wisconsin and Minnesota, armed with only a backpack, his camera, and a sense of adventure. He had always loved the isolation of the open road, the quiet stretches where it felt like the world had disappeared. But this particular trip would test the limits of his courage. On the second night of his trip, Alex found a small, run-down motel along Highway 61. The neon sign flickered intermittently, casting red and blue glows across the empty parking lot. The motel looked abandoned, but there was a single room available. The clerk was a thin man with sunken eyes, muttering in a voice that barely rose above a whisper. Alex barely noticed, eager to get to his room. The room was old-fashioned, with faded wallpaper and a bed that sagged in the middle. He unpacked quickly and decided to explore the nearby woods before nightfall. The woods were dense, the trees close together, their branches twisting like fingers. As he walked, he noticed that the air felt thick, almost suffocating, and the usual sounds of crickets and wind were absent. It was eerily silent. He set up his camera to take long exposure photos of the forest and wandered deeper. That's when he heard a faint humming, almost melodic, coming from somewhere beyond the trees. It wasn't natural, like birds or insects, but deliberate, almost human. Curious, Alex followed the sound, weaving between the trees. The humming grew louder, more insistent, as if calling him. Eventually, he stumbled into a small clearing. There was nothing there, just a circle of trees with the ground scorched black in a pattern he couldn't recognize. The humming stopped abruptly. Alex felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up, a cold sensation crawling along his spine. Then, from the shadows, he noticed movement figures standing at the edges of the clearing. They weren't human, at least not entirely. Tall, thin, with elongated limbs and featureless faces. They stood perfectly still, watching him. Alex froze, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. The creatures made no sound, but their presence was oppressive, as if the air itself had thickened around him. Panicking, he turned to run, but the forest seemed to stretch endlessly, paths twisting and doubling back in impossible ways. Hours seemed to pass as he tried to navigate back to the motel, the creatures silently following, always at the edge of his vision. When he finally reached the road, the sun was rising, though it felt like a lifetime had passed. His car was where he had left it, but inside there were scratches on the dashboard deep enough to bleed, forming symbols he couldn't recognize. Shaken but determined to leave, Alex started driving. The road ahead seemed normal at first, but then he noticed the same figures appearing at intervals, always just at the edge of the tree line, watching him as he sped past. Panic set in. He tried taking side roads, but the figures always appeared, as if the forest itself were hunting him. He finally reached a small town, where he stopped at a diner to collect himself. The locals seemed odd, too. They spoke in hushed tones and avoided his eyes, giving him the same strange, unblinking stare he had seen in the motel clerk. He asked about the forest, the clearing, the marks on his car, but they only shook their heads and muttered warnings about wandering too far. Alex left the town immediately, vowing never to return. But even weeks later, he found himself looking over his shoulder, feeling the same oppressive presence he had experienced in the forest. He reviewed the photos he had taken, only to discover that the clearing appeared in every image, though he swore he hadn't seen it when taking them. Worse, faint silhouettes could be seen among the trees, watching, always watching. He tried to rationalize its stress, exhaustion, imagination, but deep down, he knew what he had encountered was real. He never spoke publicly about it, fearing ridicule, but he shared the story with close friends, emphasizing the importance of caution when venturing into isolated areas. The experience left him with nightmares, recurring dreams of faceless figures and endless forests, a memory that never faded. A year later, he returned to the Midwest, but only to the urban areas, carefully avoiding the backroads and highways he had once loved. He kept his distance from forests, even those that seemed perfectly safe, because he couldn't shake the feeling that those creatures or something like them were patient, waiting, always lurking just out of sight. The next story takes us to a group of 4 friends, Ethan, Sarah, Lucas, and Mia, who decided to take a road trip through the vast deserts of Nevada. They wanted adventure, isolation, and the thrill of the open road. The plan was simple. Drive from Las Vegas to a small, remote ghost town they had read about online, rumored to be haunted by miners who had died under mysterious circumstances decades ago. It was a decision that would haunt them far longer than the supposed ghosts of the town. They started their journey in the afternoon, the sun blazing over the asphalt. The desert stretched endlessly on either side, an ocean of sand and jagged rock formations. Spirits were high, laughter filled the car, and music blasted from the speakers. As the miles passed, the scenery became more surreal, a combination of eerie beauty and stark isolation. But slowly, a creeping unease began to settle over them. The GPS signal started dropping in and out, and the radio began to pick up strange static bursts, sometimes forming faint, whisper-like sounds. Hours into the drive, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the the friends turned onto an unpaved road leading directly to the ghost town. Darkness fell quickly in the desert, and the headlights of the car illuminated only the sandy path ahead. At first, they laughed about the creeping shadows and odd noises, blaming the wind or the desert wildlife. But then they noticed something strange, tracks in the sand alongside the road, large and deep, as if made by something heavy, something not human. Lucas joked that they were being followed by desert spirits, and the others laughed nervously. But when the tracks began to mirror their own path, appearing directly beside the car no matter how far they drove, the laughter faded. Ethan slowed down, scanning the surrounding darkness. Nothing moved, and yet the sense of being watched grew heavier with every mile. Finally, they reached the ghost town. The place was eerily preserved, as if time had frozen decades ago. Rusted mining equipment, empty storefronts, and abandoned homes lined the streets. The friends parked the car and decided to explore. Flashlights in hand, they walked among the ruins, joking to keep the fear at bay. But as they explored, Mia noticed scratches along the walls of the abandoned buildings, deep, chaotic, almost clawed, forming symbols none of them recognized. Sarah felt a chill and insisted they should leave, but Lucas convinced them to continue just a little further. They discovered a decrepit building that looked like a former saloon. Inside, the air was stale, and the darkness seemed almost physical, pressing down on them. Then they heard a soft scratching sound, coming from the walls themselves, echoing like nails on wood. They froze, their laughter silenced. The sound grew louder, circling the room, impossible to locate. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and their breath became visible in the flashlight beams. A low, guttural growl resonated from the corners of the room. Ethan tried to calm everyone, but the sound of footsteps began to echo outside the building, circling, pacing, but never approaching the door. They realized they were not alone. Panicked, they ran back to the car, only to find the tracks from earlier leading directly up to their vehicle, now accompanied by more scratches on the side doors, fresh and deep. They sped away, hearts pounding, the desert night pressing in like a living entity. But the terror did not end there. About an hour later, they noticed headlights in the distance. Not another car, but multiple lights, moving in unnatural patterns, weaving across the desert as if tracking them. Lucas tried to take a shortcut through a narrow canyon to lose whatever was following, but the lights mirrored every turn, every maneuver. It was as if the desert itself had eyes, watching, waiting. Hours passed, and exhaustion and fear set in. They stopped at a rest area to regroup, but the moment they exited the car, the lights disappeared. Only then did they notice the sand near the rest area, hundreds of footprints, not human, not entirely animal, surrounding the car and vanishing into the darkness. None of them could explain how the tracks appeared or where they led. The desert, which had once seemed like an exciting backdrop for adventure, now felt alive, hostile, and predatory. The friends eventually made it back to Las Vegas, but the desert had left its mark. Sarah began having nightmares, waking up screaming about glowing eyes in the sand and shadows moving with intent. Ethan noticed scratches on his hands, small but deep, with no memory of how he got them. Mia felt constantly watched, even in crowded places, while Lucas became obsessed with researching the ghost town and its history, uncovering reports of disappearances, strange lights, and unexplainable sounds from travelers who had dared to explore the area. Weeks later, Ethan received a package at his apartment, an envelope with no return address. Inside were photos of the friends taken at the ghost town, but in each image, faint shadows appeared behind them, shapes that weren't there when the photos were taken. Scratches appeared on the envelope, similar to the marks on their car and in the buildings. Fear gripped him as he realized the desert experience wasn't confined to the night of the road trip. It had followed them, manifesting in ways beyond explanation. The friends eventually stopped traveling together, haunted not just by fear, but by the realization that some places hold a power beyond comprehension. The desert had welcomed them, but it had also marked them, leaving behind a memory that no amount of daylight or crowded streets could erase. They never returned to Nevada, nor did they speak openly about what happened, afraid that acknowledging it fully might draw the desert's attention again.